Some common crimes that are punishable by death are first-degree murder, treason, murder involving torture, terrorist murder, murder related to carjacking. In general, any murder with evidence of intent can be subject to be punishable by the death penalty.
In Furman v. Georgia, a case of 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled by a vote of 5 to 4 that capital punishment, which is currently active on a state and federal level, was unconstitutional. The majority held that, in violation of the Eighth Amendment, the death penalty was cruel and unusual punishment. It was the first time that the nation's highest court had ruled against capital punishment.
On June 29, 1972, the Supreme Court ruled the de facto moratorium, which is a delay or suspension of an activity or a law. The Furman v. Georgia case was a criminal case which invalidated the death penalty statutes in the United States. 35 of the 50 states used Furman's case to develop a better constitutionally acceptable statute that does not violate the Fourth and the Eighth Amendments, since the death penalty violated these amendments. Because of this, over 600 death sentences were overturned, and instead they were turned into life imprisonment. On July 2, 1976, the U.S. Supreme Court reaffirmed constitutionality of the death penalty. The Gregg v. Georgia case was the case that brought back the death penalty. The only way they would consider the death penalty for Gregg was if the murder was committed while the offender was engaged in the commission of other capital felonies. Secondly, that he committed the murder for the purpose of receiving the victim's money and automobile. And lastly, the murder was outrageously horrible and inhumane. Gregg was charged with committing armed robbery and murder and it was also considered as inhumane. Therefore, he was sentenced the death penalty. While waiting for his death date, he escaped and was the first to escape from the Georgia State Prison as the first death row breakout in Georgia history.
On July 19, 1976, Gilmore robbed a gas station in Orem, Utah, where he shot and killed a clerk in the head. The very next day, Gilmore robbed and killed a motel manager. Though he admitted to killing both people due to the lack of evidence in one of the murders, Gilmore was only tried for one of them. After a brief deliberation, the jury found Gilmore guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death. After given an option of the method of his execution, a firing squad or a hanging, Gilmore opted to be shot. The sentence was to be carried out the following month. When Gilmore's lawyers subsequently attempted to appeal his case, Gilmore fired his lawyers. During the ensuing legal struggle, Gilmore attempted suicide twice and went on a hunger strike in protest of the delay for his execution. On January 19, 1977, Gilmore was executed by a firing squad in Utah. Gilmore was the first man to be executed in the United States for 10 years and the first after the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty.
Rebecca Steffoff says, Gregg gave states the green light to implement the death penalty as long as jurors received adequate guidance. Half a year later, on January 17, 1977, the first execution in the United States since June 1967 took place. The condemned man was Gary Gilmore, convicted in Utah of murder. Like Wallace Wilkerson in Utah Territory a century earlier, Gilmore was executed by firing squad at his request.
In 1974, Elric Anthony Coker, serving a number of sentences for murder, rape, kidnapping, and assault, escaped from prison. He broke into a Georgia couple's home, raped the woman, and stole the family's car. The woman was released shortly thereafter without further injuries. The Georgia courts sentenced Coker to death on rape charge. In a 7-2 decision, the court held that the death penalty was grossly disproportionate punishment for the crime of rape. The court noted that nearly all states at the time declined to impose such a harsh penalty, with Georgia being the only state that authorized death for the rape of an adult woman. Because rape did not involve the taking of another human life, the court found that the death penalty excessive in its severity and revocability. Oklahoma was the first state in the United States to adopt lethal injection as a means of execution. When the lethal injection is used, the condemned person is usually bound to a gurney, and a member of the execution team positions several heart monitors on the skin. 2 needles are then inserted into usable veins, usually in the inmate's arm. Long tubes connected to needles through through a hole in the cement block wall to several intravenous drips. The first is a harmless saline solution that is started immediately. Then, at the warden's signal, a curtain is raised to expose the inmate to witnesses in an adjoining room. Then the inmate is injected with various chemicals and an anesthetic which puts the inmate to sleep. Then flows a few more chemicals that paralyze the entire muscle system and stops the inmate's breathing. Finally, a flow of potassium chloride stops the heart. Death results from anesthetic overdose and respiratory and cardiac arrest while the condemned person is unconscious.